Thank you so much, Mrinalini. That was so beautifully done. And it's a very proud moment for me to be a part of this initiative that is completely run by our students, and also to have two very distinguished scholars as a part of this particular discussion and this deliberation today. As Mrinalini very rightly said, this Harmony project is actually a year-long project, and we have been doing various programs. In that entire discourse, we have what is called as the Wisdom Wednesdays, where we have discussions and deliberations on various topics from a very academic kind of a standpoint. So in this deliberation today to have two stalwarts in their field, Dr. Meenakshi Jain and Dr. Chakravarti, is absolutely an honor, and we are absolutely and so totally delighted. Thank you so much to the two of you for accepting this particular invitation. So, without wasting too much time, I'd like to basically say about Dr. Jain, where she has worked so exhaustively in the space of culture and history. And what I have understood going through a lot of her works, as well as various, the works that she's written, as well as the various videos which are so beautifully available on the various channels, her importance that she actually gives to source studies, and the way the authenticity with which she works with sources, and how she brings these sources and interprets history in that particular fashion and that particular manner. So, which I think is so important, because source study is actually the basic feature of making any particular kind of a cultural constructions. And the deliberations that Dr. Jain has done is very unique, and it's also adding another dimension to our historic studies and research. So we are all going to be so enlightened, ma'am, just listening to your views and on the topics that you're going to be speaking on various aspects of literature, on philosophical growth, as well as on the entire concept of land and the importance of geography and the effect on Indian culture, and also how harmony becomes a very important point in that entire space. So thank you, Dr. Jain, for accepting and for coming for this beautiful deliberation that we have actually embarked on. Now, as far as Dr. Chakravarti goes, the ideas that he actually puts across is more from the practical standpoint, being an IAS officer for so many years. So we would be so delighted to listen to Sir as far as how the practical aspect of harmony and how it actually has an impact on society. And Dr. Chakravarti is also an art historian, and he's worked on Khajuraho. So for me, as a researcher, I call myself a Jignasu as far as ancient Indian culture goes. So I'm so delighted to have the two of you, because along with all the participants today and a lot of our students, I think it's going to be a big learning experience for all of us. So I'd like to welcome both of you, and I'd like the deliberations to begin. And may I kindly invite Dr. Jain to start the discussion, followed by Dr. Chakravarti. After the deliberations are over, we will basically keep the panel open for questions. So I would request all the participants to actually hear Shravana, to listen to what our scholars are saying, and then start asking your questions on the chat box. So with this, Dr. Jain, usually we would say the podium, we would say the stage. Now I would say the screen is all yours. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Radha Kumar, for your generous introduction. Good evening to everybody. And thank you, St. Xavier's, for inviting me to this important seminar that you're having, this important discussion on harmony in diversity. Now, given the time constraints, I'll immediately begin with making the few points that I want to make in the first round. India is a unique case where harmony in diversity has been the bedrock of its civilization from the very outset. And luckily for us, we have a lot of textual evidence to substantiate this point. I'd like to begin by quoting the Prithvi Sukta in the Atharva Ved. Now, this Prithvi Sukta is 63 verses long, and it has been described as the first national song in the world. It is a fusion of patriotism. By patriotism, I mean love for the land, cultural awareness, and a historical tradition rooted in unity in diversity. This Prithvi Sukta begins by describing this land as the place where the ancestors displayed their valor and dharma sustains everything. It describes the land from the Himalayas to the Sindhus. It talks about 6 seasons, flora, fauna, agriculture, and crafts. It extols the natural beauty, resources, and wealth of this land. And it takes note of the diversity of the inhabitants, their varying dialects, and their behavioral patterns and behavioral norms. And it says that this land nurtures all its inhabitants. It is not a mother to some and a stepmother to others. So this is the first textual evidence that we have of a recognition, acknowledgement, and elevation of the diversity of this land. And this verse ends by talking about the ideal and the values that sustain this land, and that is truth and cosmic law. Now, the first textual work that we have, we all know, is the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda, when it is composed, the composers are not aware of the entire landmass of the subcontinent. They are only aware of northwestern India and Punjab. As they travel, as they expand and they explore the rest of the subcontinent, that exploration is also recorded in the various literary texts that are available to us. And it's very important because these literary texts also substantiate the topic of our discussion, harmony in diversity. And I'd just like to quote one text, that is the Shatpat Brahmana. The Shatpat Brahmana records the discovery of the eastern parts of the subcontinent. And it is very interesting that it says that in this eastern area, mounds are there and the people revere these mounds as the place where their dead are cremated. And we know that subsequently stupas by the Buddhists and by the Jains were also built. So what we see is that as the framer, as the Vedic people, let me put it like this, as the Vedic people go on exploring larger and larger parts of the subcontinent, they come across various inhabitants, they accept, elevate the practices and beliefs of these people. And I've given you the example of the mounds. Now, the Dharma Shastras that were composed in the before Common Era, the Dharma Shastras record that the customs of the different communities are their dharma. So they are also giving great importance to accepting diversity, not only accepting, embracing, elevating it. So they say the custom of every community is its dharma. The Dharma Shastras recorded the customs of every community that they could find, and they say that the Dharma Shastras say that the custom of every community is its dharma. Now, in the ancient period, we had several foreign dynasties ruling over parts of northwestern India. For example, the Persians, the Greeks, the Shakas, the Parthians, the Kushans, and the Huns. So there were so many of these people ruling over parts of northwestern India. What did the ancient lawgivers say about these foreigners, foreign rulers? How were they treated in the context of our discussion, harmony in diversity? Now, it is very interesting that Manu, we know the great Manu, the lawgiver, he first of all says that there are only 4 castes and the rest are their offsprings. And they are people who have been given a lower caste because they neglected their sacred duties. So again, it's a question, it's assimilating. It is saying that they neglected their sacred duties, but it does not talk about anyone outside the system. The next point that I want to make is that, India kept its doors open to outsiders, but it did not turn to other sources for inspiration for its spiritual and philosophical quest. And so we have a person, Pythagoras. You've all heard of Pythagoras. He was the great philosopher and he's known for his theorem. And he is supposed to have come to India in the 6th century BC. And what is important for us is that Pythagoras is associated with the doctrine of metempsychosis. Now, what is metempsychosis? It is the belief that on the death of a person, the soul does not die, it enters another body. And we know that this belief in metempsychosis has been such an important part of our philosophy and cultural heritage down the ages. Then there is another evidence that we have, that Alexander, when he comes to India, he writes about a group of people that he met at Taxila, and they are called gymnosophists. Gymnosophists are ascetic philosophers. So this ability of India to attract people from outside on the basis of its spiritual quest, there was no great means of communication. Indians were going outside. It's not that they were not going outside. In the Indus Valley period, we know of them going outside to trade, but the philosophical and meaning of life, these kind of questions, we engaged ourselves, but it is important that so many people came at that time to engage and to listen to us. We have the Chinese who came learning about Buddhism, and we have a very interesting account by an early Arab, Masudi. He writes that hikmah, that is wisdom, came from India. So there is this exchange going on, and I mentioned foreign rulers, and I would like to specifically mention 2-3 of them. One is Menander. Menander was a Greek, and he ruled over parts of North India, and he is remembered till today because he engaged in a dialogue with a Buddhist saint, Nagsena, and the dialogue between the two has been preserved in a text called the Milinda Pahano, or the Questions of King Milinda. So this kind of exchange that was going on, and we have Greeks donate statues, of Greeks, we have inscriptions, and this kind of exchange
Celeste, are we okay?
Ma'am, I think there's a connection problem from Dr. Meenakshi's end.
Is going on, it's all talking about.
So is it possible for us to send her a message?
Yes, ma'am, we'll do that. Till then, if you'd like Dr. Kalyan to take over.
Okay, is Sir Dr. Chakravarti?
Yeah.
So would you want to take off from where Dr. Jain had left, because there seems to be a connection issue at her end?
No problem. I mean, in fact, I would like to comment on the interaction which has taken place.
Yes.
And for instance, I mean, there was a mention about languages.
Yeah.
We have surveyed, because I was chairman of the Bhasha Trust,
Yeah.
already about 780, tribal languages, most of which are oral and unscripted. And there are many more languages which remain to be, recorded and documented. So the linguistic diversity here ultimately may prove to be higher than that of Papua New Guinea. The second thing is about worldly art. I mean, these are oral traditions, and so far as Indian rock art is concerned, we have proved evidence of about 100,000 year old petroglyphs in Bhimbetka, and 40,000 year petroglyphs and rock art in other parts of the country. And worldly art is analogous to some of these forms.
Yes.
Then thirdly, I mean, so far as my thesis is concerned, I am, concerned with history as well as the present, but my approach has been to avoid the divisive issues in history and to concentrate on development in the present, because I have seen that much of the time the divisive issues are used by interested elements to divert attention from developmental perspectives and problems which are clear and present, whether it is ecology, whether it is biodiversity, whether it is linguistic diversity, whether it is migration, whatever it is. I mean, it is necessary to concentrate on the present. And the other thing is that it is very important to go beyond the textual evidence, because 85% of our tradition is oral and contextual. It is unscripted and oral, and much of this knowledge is unharvested and unrecorded. And even today, as these hinterland communities are gradually languishing or vanishing from the scene or losing their diversity, it is very important to record and recognize their orality and knowledge systems, because that is where the diversity lies. And they have access to some of the most important knowledge systems. For instance, I mean, Andaman Nicobar, the great Andamanis, had 50 words for a wave in the sea, how it looks in the sun, how it looks in the declining sun, how it looks when the surf rises, etc., etc. So with these preliminary observations, I would also point out that there's been a lot of discussion about castes and varnas, and foreign travelers' accounts, and the origin of these various castes. I mean, whereas we have the Gita, which clearly says, "Je jathamam prapaddante tang sathaiva bhajamam." So there has been always a provision for transition from one caste to another, and depending on the variation in guna and karma. And then even through all history, I mean, it is most important to stress the positive traditions. As Akbar was mentioned, the Rahi Akal, he clearly described it as Rahi Akal, the path of reason, because you cannot govern an empire without uniting it. And so therefore he tried to establish the Rahi Akal. And then as the Bhakti tradition, the Bhakti tradition has been not only medieval, its roots can be traced to the Upanishads, and the movement from the office of sacrifice to that of puja, it becomes strong there. But its seeds germinate even in the Vedas, and in all the Vedas there is this seed of devotion. And when we recall the words of Kabir, "Koi jape Rahim Rahim, koi jape hai Ram, Das Kabir hai Prem Pujari, dono ko pranam." So then you understand what really this Bhakti movement meant. Then we should also remember that the Upanishads and the Vedas, the Vedanta, they ultimately, culminated in a global movement. The global movement in USA in the Concord movement, which was advocated by people like Emerson, Thoreau, Walt Whitman, etc. And then in transcendentalism in other parts of the world, and in German philosophers, as well as in metaphysical poetry in England. Blakes. So one should look at that ramification of Indian, thought through the entire globe. It is our task to rejuvenate this mission and not to throttle it or thwart it. So when I talk about my mission, I have been always trying to, overcome divisive issues by total involvement of all the communities. And it has never been difficult. I mean, it begins with law and order, of course, because I have to deal with, I have dealt with Naxalite insurgency, as well as common trouble, student trouble, and it has always been effective to the communities to discuss them, and also discuss with the media, because the media can play a vital role in leading or misleading public opinion. So therefore, as soon as they're brought together, one has a discussion about the real issues, and these see what is being done, they cooperate. Apart from that, I would stress as I said, the local traditions. I have always seen that whether it is Malabari swing songs or Sangam literature, or the Gond, dancers, or the Naga girl Hamrumai, I mean, imitating her patterns, weaving patterns from leaves, bamboo leaves, etc. Now these are all traditions, I mean, which are traditions of confluence all over the country. So one must recognize them apart from the textual tradition. This is what I am insisting on, the contextual as well as the textual. And it is very important to relate the context to the text, because there is a continuity and convergence between the two. And I would just quote from one text, I mean, the Tamil Nannul, which describes the philosophy of education, because this is an educational institution, for sustainable ecological practices. It says the student is not to be like a porous pot that loses all. He should not be like a goat which eats the tips alone, nor like a buffalo which muddies the water while drinking it, or a strainer which retains the dregs while straining the water, or like any of these miscreants. They should actually be like the earth, which yields according to labor invested, or like the swan, which discriminates, and like the cow that ruminates. So it's a wonderful message, I mean, from about 2000 years earlier, I mean, for the education today. And these are the same lessons which we find in the Veda. The way, the education is there, it has been laid down, the practices have been laid down, the ashrama education. I mean, it's full of ecological practices, of interdependence of organic and inorganic communities, of, human and non-human communities. And these are all practices which are in harmony with science. I mean, as A.N. Whitehead, the mathematical philosopher, says, the essence of rhythm is the fusion of sameness and novelty, so that the whole never loses the essential unity of the pattern, while the parts exhibit the contrast arising from the novelty of their detail. Now, apart from, you tell me whenever I'm to stop, okay? And so what I'm trying to say is that this inclusive consultative approach has been the approach in my development, not only in intersectarian violence to forestall it, but also to promote community partnership in development. I mean, for instance, I was Additional Chief Secretary of Forest. So we set up about 3,500 forest communities in Chhattisgarh when insurgency was at its height. And we involved all the communities, irrespective of their persuasions, in the management of the forest. We also gave them about 100,000 acres of forest to manage and to see which plants can sprout. And in fact, they recognized plants which are not even known to the Botanical Survey of India in its 5 stories. So it is very important that as we did this, and we also brought the genotypied and nomadic communities together, and they tried to look at their creativity, we immediately saw how the insurgency itself diminished. Instead of only dealing with through police, we could deal with it through development. And there was not only an improvement in voting percentage, but there was also, a participative gest. So these are the important things. And apart from these, we have also seen cultural conservation as a platform to bring people together. Whether it is Hajo in Assam, where the Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism converge, whether it is indigenous materials and techniques of conservation, and in fact, for instance, manuscript conservation, since I was also in charge of the manuscript mission for the nation. So Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah of Bijapur, he had written this Kitab-e-Noras, and we got it sung by the Dagar Bandhus. And then it was the Kashyapa Silpa Samhita, a text on iconometry. We got it translated into actual sculptures by artists of Karnataka. So that is the way to revitalize the manuscripts, and not just to compile them and digitize them and bring them together. So all the eco-friendly traditions of Narmada, Sarudar Sarovar, as they were going under submergence, we brought them out through exhibitions, through in-situ seminars, and revitalization initiatives. We also did an Akidat Ki Rang, the colors of devotion at the IGNC, in which you see the liberal, and inclusive traditions were stressed. We worked with the Punjab Academy. We worked with Habib Tanveer in his drama festival, and we worked with craftsmen who have worked on bhabs, havelis, and also of our different architectural traditions together. So my point is that we must concentrate on these traditions of confluence which are still alive and nurse them on the ground, and also deal with the shrinking forests, the thinning soils, the falling aquifers, the rising temperature, the earthquakes, the mass extinction of species, mass unemployment, migration, etc., rather than only with issues of inter-community relations. The inter-community relations get corrected and improved as we deal with them on the platform of development and ecology. So I would quote to you to conclude Leibniz. I mean, the fact that even he was speaking after these ancient Indian traditions. It is his monadology. He says, each portion of matter is conceivable as a garden full of flowers, as a pond full of fishes, but each branch of the plant, each member of the animals, each drop of the humus is also such a garden or such a pond. And Chandogya Upanishad also talks about the bees which collect juices from the different trees to assemble them in an unity. So there is this great tradition of Indian thought which remains to be rejuvenated and spread. That is the unfulfilled Indian mission which remains to be fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chakravarti. That was so beautifully put, and thanks for immediately taking over. And definitely after Dr. Jain finishes, I'll start a little bit of discussion, and I think by that time, our very receptive audience will start posting the questions on the chat box. So is Dr. Jain there? Has she been able to hear that? Yes.
I didn't, but my computer was working. I didn't realize the internet.
No, ma'am, you were talking about the Smritis. I think that was the point. You were looking at literary sources. That's when the screen on your side had just frozen. So
okay, so I had talked about I talked about the foreign dynasties that came.
Yes, all that was.
And I had talked about Manu.
Yes, you did. You did.
Okay. So and I had talked about India's doors open to outsiders, like I had mentioned Pythagoras, Gymnosophists.
Yes, all that had done. Yeah.
Masudi.
Yes.
So then I would just like to make 2-3 other small points. One is the attitude of foreign rulers at this time.
Yes.
So I mentioned Menander.
Yes. You talked about Menander. Yes.
Yeah. So Menander, he is remembered till today because of his dialogue with a Buddhist saint, Nagsen. And Menander, who was a Greek, had long discussions with Nagsen, and these are recorded, and that discussion is still available to us in this text called Milinda Pahanu. So this is an exchange. It was just an exchange of people who were from outside the subcontinent, came and ruled over here. There was no discrimination, there was harmony, and there was an attempt to find, mutual ground of interaction. And the Greeks are represented At Sanchi, we have 3 inscriptions by Greeks who donated over there, and we have depictions of Greek musicians and worshippers at Sanchi. Then we have the Shakas. They also came from outside, but they became great promoters of Buddhism. And some of the relics that have survived at Shinkot and Bimaran, they have relics of the Buddha. They are the most beautiful pieces of artwork also that have survived. And we have Rudradaman Shaka. Rudradaman Shaka we remember because the first full-fledged inscription in Sanskrit is by Rudradaman Shaka. And we have the entry into India of a class of priests, Magai. They came from Iran, but because they were priests over there, they were given the status of Magai Brahmins in India, and they brought with them a form of sun worship. So, last thing I want to conclude is that Meher Kula, the Huns, Meher Kula was a Hun. The Huns are remembered for all kinds of atrocities, but Meher Kula, we have an inscription of his of 530 in which he talks about his engagement with Shaivism. And in the medieval period, we have a whole lot of saints. Each saint preaches harmony, living in harmony with all the inhabitants. No saint preaches that you live in disharmony or you spread strife. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that the connection failed in the middle. I wasn't aware of it. These are some of the points that I wanted to make up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jain, for picking up from where we lost connection, but we never really lose connection, right? Especially when we are in this lovely space. And
Yes.
It's always a harmonious connection that all of us have. So we would definitely expect a lot of questions from our audience, but just to initiate a particular point, and some of the queries and some of the questions that I myself have as a researcher and as a teacher of this particular subject, and now it's my opportunity to talk to 2 great stalwarts, I think I should not let this go. So for me, the first question to Dr. Jain is, especially when you're looking at sources, now I teach ancient Indian history, culture, archaeology, and especially when you're looking at the whole discourse and harmony, I think all our sources actually celebrates that, whether you're looking at art, architecture, or literature, everywhere. And, Dr. Chakravarti also spoke about the Vedanta, and our entire discourses celebrates this concept of Tattvamasi. We are a reflection of the cosmic essence,
Yes.
and of course the whole metaphysical spiritual aspect. So my question to Dr. Jain very specifically is this: how do we basically look at sources in that particular context? Because in a very dispassionate kind of a way. So there is a lot of challenge that most of us would face. That's the first point. And the second point also is, most of this gets interrelated and interlinked with mythology. A very simple example of that is even the beautiful icon of Nataraj. Now, I definitely, as a student of this particular beautiful subject, I know that it is symbolic. It is very, it is a metaphor. But at the academic level, how do we get these points across? So,
Okay.
Dr. Jain, if you could kindly throw some light on this. Thank you.
See, as far as the sources are concerned for the ancient period, there are many. The first is the textual. In the textual sources, the problem is to accurately date them. So for the early literary texts, it's difficult to date. But from the 2nd century BC, we are fortunate that we have a series of inscriptions. Some of the inscriptions are in fragments and some of them are complete. So from the first inscription that we have, which is a complete inscription, actually is from the 2nd century BC. It is by a Greek ambassador to the court of an Indian king. That inscription is still standing complete in Vidisha at Besnagar. So when we look at these inscriptions, we have to remember that they never thought that 2000 years later historians are going to try to interpret what we are seeing. What they felt, they wrote. Now this inscription is perhaps the most famous epigraph in Indian history, because in the 2nd century BC, this ambassador, Greek ambassador, comes to the court of an Indian king.
It's a fine effort by a bunch of kids. We are a bunch of kids. Not when we're in this room, we're not.
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can.
So this person comes and he erects this pillar, and in that inscription he writes about who he is, why he is coming, and why he is erecting this pillar. So these inscriptions, the early inscriptions, I don't think there's any debate on how they should be interpreted, because they're just factual narration. Now, the other evidence that we have is architectural. Like, for example, we have terracottas. Now, terracottas and pieces of sculpture that have survived, may not be able to interpret exactly the setting in which they were, but we do get an idea, a very good idea, of the popularity of certain deities and forms of worship and the dates at which these were popular. And you talked about Nataraj. Actually, Nataraj is a depiction that happens very late in Indian history, in Indian art history. In the beginning, Shiva, the most popular form of Shiva worship is the Shivling. And many of the temples of Shiv also had the Shivling as the main deity, and the portraits of Shiva were around. They were not the main deity. The Nataraj became popular only from the Chola period, and the person who was instrumental in popularizing Nataraj was a Chola queen. Her name was Sembian Devi. So I hope I've answered some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jain. So this actually brings me to a question to Dr. Chakravarti. You spoke about education. And they were, for example, if you're looking at the sociological setup of this country, we have the concepts like the Varnashrama Dharma you spoke about. So that basically brings us to the whole concept of the Purusharth. So how do we look at these ideologies? How do we look at these various sociological concepts in today's context, especially in today's education? Because most of this gets pushed away into oblivion. And it becomes part of structures, and sometimes these structures can get very rigid. So to have a dialogue, how do we basically integrate all of this in today's society, in our education system? Basically, how do we get this into the mainstream discourses? Dr. Chakravarti.
See, I mean, this question of Varna and Jati, to what extent it is endogamous, to what extent it is exogamous, to what extent these were fixed and immutable, to what extent there was a transition. This has been a subject of debate. But the tendency to relate this debate to reservations or other political and constitutional issues is not necessary, because we have an egalitarian democracy in which we are supposed to cater to all groups, and irrespective of their affiliation, etc. And besides, there are many groups which are outside this structure, and now because of this system of reservation, etc., there is a lot of competition to get into these rubrics and to get these designations, which becomes a contentious issue.
Yes.
But apart from that, what is important is the hinterland community. I have seen that the hinterland community, except in certain parts of the country, are not at all divided on these lines, and they are ready to come together on any issue of development, any issue of cultural conservation, any issue of ecological conservation, and I have been able to involve them throughout my career without any difficulty. One little aside about what was being discussed about art, because since I also did art, you see, much of the first appearance in art is not necessarily the first evidence of the art.
Yes.
The art has remained in conception long before it was found. In fact, much of the art was in wood and perishable material before it found its shape in stone. So therefore, to trace Indian art to art historical documents that this appeared only 2,300 years earlier is an absurdity. Our art has been there for a long time. Even the Nataraja, for instance, about which Kumarasamy has written a wonderful article, Dance of Shiva, the Panchakritas he is talking about. And the Nataraja, the concept of the dance of energy has always been there. If you look for it in, you see the Vedas, if you look for it in the Upanishads, you will see that the entire world is seen as a cosmic cycle of energy. And therefore, some of these ideas must have found fruition in iconology and iconography. And then you see, when you look at texts, I mean, there is this question of redaction. You see, Drishta, Shrota, Prokta, and Ukta. You see how the text is redacted only around the 5th century. That is what is said. But the texts were preceded by a tradition which was recitative and incantatory long before that. So one should never fix the tradition or the iconology to a particular point of time when the text talks about it, when a temple talks about it, or when a pillar shows it. We have to go back in time. For instance, Indus Valley civilization. We don't talk about it. Now, the Indus Valley civilization is closely related, I mean, to Indo-Mesopotamian civilization. And since I have also done expeditions in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, we have seen that there is a lot of connection between Indus Valley culture, the culture of Bactria, and the culture of Margian. So these areas of research remain completely, you see, unforeseen and unsurveyed. Most of the diplomacy remains directed towards Europe and America, whereas the ambassadors in Southeast Asia were complaining to me that there is much more, there is a much greater necessity for India to concentrate on Central Asia and Southeast Asia, where the real diplomacy lies, because you have contributed so much to the diaspora of ideas, to the patterns of art. So these are the important positions. For instance, if you look at the landscape, you see all the place names in all over Southeast Asia.
Yes.
They are from India. And even you see some of these slogans, like Vinayaka Thunga Lekka, this unity in diversity, which is in Brunei. So all these points are of great importance.
So my question again to both the scholars is, how do we basically articulate this concept of harmony in the spaces that we are in? Dr. Jain, as an erudite scholar, especially in the space of teaching, how do you basically interpret this in the academic spaces? Now, for example, with students and all the knowledge that we have, how do we articulate that with students, with courses that we deal with? So any experiences, ma'am, that you'd like to share with us?
I think that my experience has been that at least in the places that I taught, that students are very receptive and they don't distinguish among themselves. There is no division among themselves. At least it is not apparent to me. And I think that the ideas of modern ideas of equality, equal opportunity, they have percolated very well to all sections of society among the students.
Lovely. And Dr. Chakravarti was actually speaking about working with your experiences on the ground with the Naxalites and then giving them, I think I picked this point up that you, the entire cultural conservation. I think that's a great idea. So somewhere if we can link the relevance of the entire, the thought processes with the larger, movements of the society, I think this will literally become something which is very practical rather than just a concept that's actually buried in the books. So thank you to both the scholars, because our discussions can always continue because there's just so much to interact. But I'd like to now request questions from our audience, all participants. So if there are questions, you can definitely share it with us and we can ask our distinguished guests. Okay, so my God, there are lots of questions that has come. All right. Now there is a question from Ruchira Sharma to Dr. Jain. The question is, can you please elaborate on Mihir Kula?
Yes.
So that's the question that Ruchira is asking.
Actually, Mihir Kula was Hun. The Huns also came to India after the 5th century. And they had a reputation of, destroying wherever they went. And India also suffered devastation with the invasion of the Huns. But what is amazing and surprising is that there was this Hun ruler, Mihir Kola, and he is also, supposed to have been a very fierce person. But we have an inscription dated 530, which records his conversion to Shaivism. So that is the point that I was making.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a question from Rachel Narona to Dr. Chakravarti. Sir, can you elaborate more on the cultural conservation brings about the unity amongst different communities? So I think her question is, how do you basically look at cultural conservation, and how is it that it brings about unity amongst different communities? So this is a question that's coming from Rachel Narona.
See, I mean, there is a intrinsic link between culture and development. Normally, I mean, it is seen as something which is to be discussed, I mean, in a scholarly or a planning group. But most important is to know that all cultures in the country are community specific and eco-specific. They are specific to hills and forests and the bluffs and the spurs, the dales and the valleys. And the developmental strategy has to vary according to that variation. So therefore, when you look at the rhythm of festivals, the orality, or even the few texts that have emerged, I mean, in these areas, or, the issues of forestry, or issues of, let us say, water management, they have to be seen in the context. For instance, sacred groves. We use one configuration for sacred groves. But these are refugia of sacred biota, and there is an entire tradition of prescriptions and taboos associated with them all over the country, which have been treasured over the last few thousands of years. Now, these sacred groves are dying. They must be preserved. Similarly, I mean, water harvesting structures. Yeah. Now, you cannot have mega dams in, sensitive areas like Uttarakhand or, in the Himalayas. I mean, you have to have non-invasive, slope-hugging structures, which have been nursed through thousands of years by the local communities. Now, these have to be conserved. So, we are engaged in conserving these local developmental traditions. It is not possible to substitute either mega dams or mega forestry schemes for these small schemes, because they are absolutely local. Similarly, when one is talking about, forestry, I mean, the British principle has been of plantation. They have tried to, replace the native species by exotic species. Now, our policy was to replace the policy of plantation by assisted natural regeneration. And the same policy can apply to culture. You cannot impose Sarkari festivals on the people. They have nursed their festivals through thousands of years. All you do is to just be around. So that is what we are doing. And the conservation was done. And you see, documentation. Now, if documentation is to be taken as substitute for culture, then the IGNC Intangible Heritage Archive would be the biggest culturally educated person. But that is not true. It is not documentation. That is like an anthem. So it is very important to revitalize. When I was talking about the languages, these are not just languages which are spoken. These are languages of development. These are languages of, sustenance of biodiversity, cultural diversity. So it is very important that these languages are retained and nourished.
Absolutely. Lovely. In fact, when you were talking, sir, I was just reminded of this entire kolams, which is there in Kerala. Every house has this little water bodies, which is again a very classic system of, water harvesting, which is forgotten today. The entire, the concept of kolam, little ponds in everyone's houses. Now, this is a question to Dr. Jain. And the question is from Sumedha Rai, and she's asking, how did the diversity, and in fact, this is a very interesting question, how did the diversity not impede the social solidarity in ancient India? I mean, India has always been culturally a diverse country. I mean, we've had so many secret charm that they had, that they were all tied up in one particular kind of a thread. So Dr. Jain.
I lost connection with what you were saying. Can you
Yeah.
please repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. The question is from Sumedha Ray. She says, how did the diversity not impede the growth of social solidarity in ancient India?
Yes, yes. That's a very interesting question.
That's
Actually, the social system, everything was a unit. So there was space for everybody. The village community had space for everybody. There was no person functioning as an individual. It was a whole society, a whole community that acted together.
Absolutely.
There's some problem with the
History is
internet.
often written with a single perspective, with a certain propaganda. What should be the ethics of harmonious history writing for future historians?
Is there a problem with the internet?
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, please. Huh?
Okay, I'll just repeat the question again.
Yeah.
Stomik Rahate, his question is, today history is often written with a single perspective, with a certain propaganda.
Hello. See, I heard half your question. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Now, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I think both the scholars could maybe answer this question. Yeah.
Since I'm having a little bit of problem with the, I don't know what is, I'm just hearing half your question.
Okay. Dr. Chakravarti, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, can you hear
Yeah,
me?
so would you want to deliberate
Sure.
on this and then we
Sure,
take off
sure,
from here?
sure.
It's
I mean,
basically-
I think that the basic problem is that people have got bogged down in the historiography of the 19th and the 20th century. I mean, they have been caught in the, you see, the evangelical and the Orientalist debate. And now these are recent debates, I mean, which are always tendentious. And you see, even the interpretation of travelers' tales or literary evidence, one should remember that there is a vast amount of evidence which remains unread. Since I have dealt with archaeology on a large scale, I mean, looked after many museums and many archaeological excavations, I know that hundreds of thousands of inscriptions are lying and unread today. And hundreds of thousands of inscriptions in regional languages are lying unread. And I mean, whether any museum you look at, the Gwalior Museum, which is such a treasure of Gupta art, I mean, so unless there is a combined effort to read them, and then manuscripts, we digitize them. We don't read them, and we don't revitalize them. So it is very important that we deal with our historical material. We say that we have no historical sources. It is absurd. We have all these sources. We can access them. We can also work with the dying communities, because the communities are being invaded by mega developmental projects, and they must be allowed to retain their intangible, you see, memories and traditions, and they can assist in recovery of the 100-year history, I mean, for the past. I mean, so it is very important that you see, the contentious history comes out of tendentious application of mind to select sources culled from here and there. Now we have so many images and archival material in the British Museum, but you have to pay £34 for a page. I mean, to buy that material. So it is very important that one negotiates with them and opens up the archive and looks at the material properly, instead of getting caught up in a few accounts.
Yes. Well,
so can I now, since I've got the gist of the question.
Would you want to please add?
Yeah. So what I understood was about the sources.
Yes.
And I agree with the point that you know, we have to widen the sources that we can tap. And I just give one example that, for example, when we write Mughal history, we have had a tendency to depend largely on Persian chronicles that were written at that time. Those Persian chronicles have an advantage in the sense that they were writing, you know, they had access to developments. They were court historians, so they had access to you know, a lot of material. But the interesting thing is that if we move outside the Persian sources for that particular period and look at the works that were being produced in the courts of the Rajput kings of that same period, then we get a very different perspective.
Yeah.
Because the Persian histories are giving us the perspective of the imperial court, but the Rajput histories that were written are giving us a perspective of outside the imperial court by people who were members of that imperial court. So absolutely, I agree with Dr. Chakravarti that we have to look for more and more sources and bring more and more information to the table, rather than to try to push in an ideology. We should not, write history. There is no such thing as objective history in that sense, I agree. But when we look for facts, we should not sift facts to suit our ideological predilection.
And something that both of you actually spoke is so right, and I think it's the need of the hour. Basically, look at sources and connect the sources and study.
Yes.
Not basically, if you're looking at something like 600 BCE, 600 BCE was happening in the sense of what was happening in north, what was happening in south. One also
Yes.
needs to look what is happening in northeast. I mean, the whole
Yes.
the dialogue and the discourses has to be cohesive rather
Yes.
than in piecemeal. So just added to this particular thought, there is a wonderful question by another student and participant from, her name is Durga Yaside, and she says, while there are significant evidences to show the existence of harmony within our diverse culture, should we see harmony only as the end goal? Doesn't inclusion of different narratives, marginalized narratives and community sections be made a part of this discourse, ensuring harmony within diversity? I think, Durga, this point was discussed by both the scholars.
Yes.
But if either of you would like to add a little bit more to whatever that you said, the whole marginalized history and history that is which is not in the center stage, not the Choras, apart from the Choras and the Guptas, what does the other dynasties have to say? So, Dr. Jain or Dr. Chakravarti, either of you, anyone. How do you basically include that particular bit?
You see, shall I?
Yes, please.
Okay, you see, history has been created and has remained neglected. In fact, there are many tales of heroism, outstanding tales of heroism. At the point when you see the foreign incursions were taking place, have remained unforeseen and unrecorded and unpublicized. It is very important that, and then the second thing, apart from recording, you see, history is not just of political events. History is also of the vanishing biodiversity, history of vegetation, history of waters, history of relations between the people and their environment, and all that history is lying unrecorded and unsynthesized because nobody is looking at that history. All these government departments which are in charge of huge archival resources, there is no alignment of scholarship with the documentation. So therefore, unless they dedicate all these archival resources to scholarly research and allow the synergy to develop, the history will never emerge, because today's history cannot be political history. It cannot be a history of battles and history of struggles, and it has to be a history of time. That's all.
As you said, Doctor, it can't just be the dates. It has to basically talk about narratives. Added to this, there's a question from Anugraha Solomon to Dr. Chakravarti. I think this is more technical in the sense, the question is, how can Vedangas and Upavedas contribute to harmony? And how has that impacted the various movements around the world? I think the question more is looking at literary sources. How do we look at literature as a movement for harmony? I think that's the question that Anugraha is specifically asking Dr.
I thought that I had answered that question only. Initially, because we talked about, the Vedic tradition. The Vedic tradition does not vanish with the Vedas. The Vedic tradition continues. And all the seeds of, thought germinate in the Vedas, and they sprout in the Upanishads, I mean, which are called Vedanta.
Yeah.
And all these Upavedas, many and these Vedangas, some of which are dedicated to specific disciplines, so-called scientific disciplines. I mean, they're all scientific. And the most important thing is that the Vedic theory of consciousness is not yet properly gauged.
Yes.
It is not understood that the Vedic theory of consciousness, I mean, which has influenced, the heterodox faiths like Jainism and Buddhism, and which can be directly related to, you see, scientific theories of, isomorphism of verbal and genetic codes,
Yes.
or, non-locality and, uncertainty principles. Now, this is the relating the Vedic thought, I mean, as a scientific strand, not in the manner which aeroplane was invented in 3,000 years ago, not like that. That is fabulism. That is not history, nor is it science. So it is very important to really, find out the genuine historical element in that Vedic theory of consciousness, which ultimately unites the world. And it is this mission which remains unfulfilled, because India has not really researched that. I mean, to some extent, the Jaina and the like Haribhadra Suri, he had researched on it, and he mentioned Buddha, that he was prescribing the medicine according to the disease, the nature of attachment. And so all that, research remains interrupted. You see, even today, they have got divided into different kinds of small nuclear holes, and they're not looking at this bigger picture, which was really the fount of the entire inspiration.
So added to this, Sanjana Ratnaparki is a question to Dr. Jain. What can be done to make sure that the current education system gives a fair voice to the harmony concept that can be seen in texts and other sources, and integrates that into the present day discourses at a collective as well as an individual level? So I think all of us who are in the teaching profession, in the sense of looking at subjects like this, I think this is surely a definite challenge that all of us have.
But I believe the new education policy has made great strides in this direction.
Yeah.
And we have to see how it is implemented actually.
Yes,
but I think lots of these things have been taken care of in the new education policy. I have not gone through it, but I am told it is very well drafted.
Okay. So I think the other two questions that are there, I think it has already been answered. Mrinalini Sampath's question and Ms. Reddy's question. How did Vedic culture and education have influenced harmony of a society? I think both have actually touched on this particular point, and there has been a lot of deliberation on this. So are there any more questions, Celeste? Do we have any more questions? Because
Ma'am, yes, we have some questions.
yeah. Do you want to see it from the chat box? Let me just see. Okay.
Yes. So there's a question by Janvi Deshpande. Ma'am, if you can...
Let me just see if that
Yes.
particular point has already been answered, because find traces of history in Rigveda and all this knowledge is to see. Yeah, so this is basically a question that's coming from Janvi Deshpande, and this whole concept is how this particular knowledge that is there is sometimes subjected to a lot of misinterpretations, which causes many disputes between people and ideologies. With the permission of both the scholars, if I can pitch in, because I think this particular point has already been touched by both the scholars. I think, Janvi, the whole point is, as both our speakers have been saying, it's studying the sources in the right light, and then looking at it holistically, and also integrating the source study. We can't just look at one inscription and one particular verse and say that is it. There has to be synergy, and since we are all talking about harmony, there has to be a harmony between an archaeological source, a literary source, and also the time period of that time, the political history of that particular period, right? So unless and until that particular or that path is taken, there could be the kind of problems that we are actually facing today. Yeah. So I think that particular point was already answered by both the scholars. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to what I said, Dr. Chakravarti?
I think,
did I summarize it
I would, for instance, to give concrete examples, about all these controversies. I mean, it is quite irrelevant to the history whether, let us say the Babri Masjid was a mosque or a temple. I mean, if there is a 12th century temple or earlier remnants, that's okay. But then the evidence should be enough for the two groups to unite and decide. In the same way, I mean, when we talk about demolition of monuments, sites either by Hindus or by Muslims or by other Hindu rulers for each other, I mean, to look for the motivation is irrelevant. What is important is to protect the hundreds of thousands of monuments. Because I know, let us say, there are about 25 to 30,000 monuments and sites which are protected in the country. But there must be about million sites and monuments which remain unprotected. So it is much more important to, ensure that all those sites are protected, because they are veritable, mines of history. Because the art can be also used to, lodge and fix history. I mean, rather than history fixing the art and chronology. So it is very important that controversy is easy to avoid when one concentrates on the ground realities and concentrates on conservation, rather than take a predetermined theory and then apply it to a current situation and then deal with it on partisan platform. That's it.
So this is a question that's, I think, to both the scholars, and I think that's actually the need of the hour today, and we need to deliberate on this. This is from Joel Alexander. And I have to say that this entire endeavor of Wisdom Wednesdays, along with the student group, Joel has been very, very, receptive in actually taking this ahead. So the question that he's asking is, what are the contemporary threats to harmony in our country today? Do we face any challenges from the corporates or government bodies, or even citizens and particular kind of communities with vested interests? So this is a question that one of our student participants has asked. So it's open to both our scholars.
You can just read the newspapers and see the challenges that are there. It's reported every day. There's so many challenges on every front.
Yes.
Well,
so, Joel, would you want to add, would you want to unmute yourself and, yeah?
Meenakshi ji or me? We are addressing whom?
I'm sorry, I was asking
the student.
The student, if he wants to ask the question, or Dr. Chakravarti, would you want to add to that point, which Dr. Jain just spoke about?
You see, I mean,
challenges, what are the...
I always deal with concrete things, for instance, I mean, like, the discussion about many Ramayanas or one Ramayana, or, many Mahabharatas, one Mahabharata. It is absolutely clear that there are hundreds of Mahabharata and Ramayana traditions, and I have recorded them. I have recorded them in the Northeast, in the Southeast, in Asia, in Central Asia, all over. Now, these traditions are, again, an architectonic harmony. There might be minor variations according to regional, themes, and the regional heroes enter the... So the unity in diversity can be easily understood when one looks at these regional versions. That is one concrete aspect. So instead of quarreling about it, one looks at the evidence. In the same way, I mean, when it comes to any contentious issue, the point is to look at the evidence. For instance, after the Second World War, the France and Russia, France and Germany, they decided to get together and write a joint history, and that joint history project was very successful. Similarly, I mean, Nelson Mandela, he remained in the jail for 27 years, but he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to ensure that there was no rancor. Martin Luther King, I mean, he said, it is not the violence of the few that worries me, but it is the silence of the many. Now, most of the people who are concerned, they're also silent, but they should be vocal only with information and knowledge, not, I mean, just speak out of prejudice or predetermined, suggestions or preconceptions.
Absolutely. This is a question to Dr. Jain. What can be done to overcome these threats or conflicts to establish societal harmony?
What can be done to
overcome? What can be done to overcome these threats or conflicts to establish societal harmony? This is a question from Mrinalini Sampath.
This is a very general question. I really don't know how to answer. The citizens have to be aware and conscious and make sure that they don't fall prey to false propaganda. Alert citizenry, I think, is very important.
Yeah. And there's another question which is very similar to this from Nagaratni, Amreshwaran Reddy. Do you think that religious organizations have a pivotal role in national harmony in 21st century? How would you look at that? Do you think that religious organizations have a pivotal role in national harmony in 21st century? Dr. Chakravarti, what do you think? Because you are basically a field person. So
you see, religious organizations should be seen in terms of institutional framework. For instance, there are Jain Basadis, then there are Hindu mutts, then there are masjids. I mean, also madrasas, and then there are other non-denominational organizations also, which have institutions. I mean, which are based on persuasions of certain communities. So these have enormous resources in terms of manuscripts and archival resources, and they also work with them. But earlier, for instance, in the South, there was a tradition of teaching 10 disciplines, and I have dealt with those institutions. For instance, in Pudukkottai and other places, I mean, all these mutts were directly linked to about 80, 90 villages, and they were acting as centers of education. And unlike in North India, in South India, you see, let us say about 5-6 persons, a family, was looking after a temple which was spread about on about 5 acres. Whereas in North India, we see less of it. So one cannot depend entirely on government for everything. I mean, the community, working with the community is the answer to all, divisive issues. I have seen that the community knows what is in its interest, and if one discusses with them and frankly and fearlessly, and then the issues are solved and they cooperate. That is my impression, and it is possible.
Lovely. It's so nice, Dr. Chakravarti, in today's day and age, and especially the situation that we are in, when you say it is possible, it's the whole concept of never to settle, because there's always hope, and there's always a ray of hope at the end of the tunnel. So it was absolutely a wonderful deliberation, a lot of thoughts that came up. And in fact, this opened up a very interesting concept, because the entire Discourse of Harmony project that we're talking about, we've had a series of programs. We've had programs where we had music concerts, then we had this whole question of poems that were read. So the academic deliberation in this entire space, with 2 great stalwarts like you, has added a very, very interesting dimension, and it's actually raised this entire endeavor that we at DIRS, with our student body, we are actually embarked on. So before we actually finally close, I'd like concluding comments from Dr. Jain and Dr. Kumar, basically just to advise and to tell us, where do we go from here? What's your advice? How do we go from strength to strength? Dr. Jain.
I think this initiative that the students have taken is absolutely remarkable, and the fields that they have covered. And, because through this medium, they will be able to spread these ideas to a wider section, to their families, to their friends, to their society. So this is I see more and more students at other universities also coming forward and becoming aware of these issues that they have to tackle, and trying to, find answers to them. So I think it's very, very encouraging and really wonderful to come across students deliberating on such serious issues. So I really congratulate Xavier's for this initiative.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Dr. Chakravarti?
Well, according to me, charity begins at home. So therefore, the Xavier's College should look at its own hinterland. It should look at, some of the 8th century monuments which are there in Mumbai itself. It should look at the 2nd century BC, caves which are around. It should look at the mohallas, and the culture of the mohallas. It should look at the what is it called, Kala Ghora festival. And it should look at the way the communities have come together. It should look at the Bombay Fort, how it is an ecological phenomenon. It should look at Elephanta and Kailash Temple, etc. And it should look at the unique blend which has brought prosperity to Mumbai, and the way even the cinema. The cinema has been a culture of confluence rather than division. There has always been and that cinema has been most popular in Central Asia. In fact, I mean, when I visit such places, they ask me, oh, are you related to Mithun Chakrabarti? Are you, have you met such and such person? They are so popular. So it is very important to harvest these strengths of the city and engage, you see, the students in field projects on micronuclear things, which also relate to larger issues.
Absolutely. That was so well said. And in our little humble way, as far as college goes, in Xavier's goes, it's we've just completed 150 years. It's a very old institution. And we also have the Heras Institute. I think you must have heard of it. Father Heras's collection of various artifacts, beautiful Gandhara sculptures. The Amarapali sculpture is there. Along with this, we also have some very interesting programs like the extracurricular credits that are there where students participate in various activities. Then we have what is called as the Learning for Life program, where just about 2 weeks back, there was an entire session that was conducted. So, and of course, we have this very interesting thing, which is also called as the cross-faculty courses, where at the SY second year level, science students take some arts courses and arts students take science courses for 1 semester. So that, you know, there is this vakya, there is this dialogue that actually happens amongst all the subjects instead of just everything being compartmentalized. So in a very little way, we are also trying to spread this beautiful concept and this entire idea, which has been part of our culture, which is Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. The truth is one, but people call it by different names. And the entire dialogue, the dialectical traditions that we have, whether we're looking at Nati Shastra, whether we're looking at Milinda Panya, whether we're looking at Bhagavad Gita, the whole concept is always have a dialogue. So this little, setting that we had today virtually, okay, I think this was very beautiful to have initiated this kind of a conversation on behalf of the DIRS, on behalf of our director and our rector of our college, Dr. Father Keith D'Souza, our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, and the management, and I as a faculty associated with DIRS. I'd really like to thank the two stalwart scholars for having taken the time out to participate in this very little humble endeavor of ours. Dhanyavad. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I would now request Mrinalini, our student coordinator, who's been actually, in touch with you, to kindly, propose the vote of thanks. Mrinalini, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Radha ma'am, Meenakshi ma'am, and Kalyan sir for an engaging discussion which has given us lots to take back home. I also thank the audience to have attended and actively participated in this session. The fundraiser with Sparsha Charitable Trust will be devoted to providing for families so that their children do not have to discontinue their education. If you feel you connect with the cause, your contribution will be going in making a child's life better in these trying times. The link for fundraiser will be shared in the chat box. We will put it in the chat box now, and it will also be further shared on the WhatsApp group and will be sent via email as well. The next session, Nature Nurtures, is on the 2nd of September, which will be the second last session of our journey of wisdom traditions. We will be discussing about the lessons we can learn from Mother Nature. Our last session is on the 9th September, which will be on imagining alternative futures with Mr. Manish Jain, an alumnus of Harvard University and the founder of Shikshantar and an advocate of the unlearning community. The session will be about rethinking our conditioning of our daily lives. So I hope you enjoyed this session and we hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.